Go if you must. I will not judge you. You have families, children who need you. I have lived free. I will not die a slave.
Those were the words of Pash, an aging Kuki chief, when some of his warriors begged him to surrender to the British. He looked at them, young, afraid, torn between life and honor, and said,
When my grandchildren hear of this day, I want them to say, he fought to the end. He showed the British that we are not cowards, not dogs to be whipped. That is worth more than living 10 more years as a servant.
That moment, quiet, defiant, captured the very soul of the Anglo-Kuki War. A war not of conquest or greed, but of dignity. Before we dive deep into what happened, you might want to watch the video popping up on your screen. It explains how the spark was lit. But for now, stay with me here. Because what we're about to explore isn't just history, it's pain, pride, and survival written in fire. Impact of Anglo-Kuki War. When the British Empire moved against the Kukis, they didn't fight one battle. They burned an entire world. Over 126 Kuki villages went up in flames. 16 more were wiped off the map. Crops gone, livestock slaughtered, food reserves torched. Even the Mithans, sacred to the Kukis, were killed. Imagine standing in the ashes of your home, the sky black with smoke, knowing your next meal might be a handful of forest leaves. That's not war, that's annihilation. Thousands died, not all from bullets. Malaria, smallpox, and starvation did the rest. Families were herded into makeshift camps where disease spread faster than hope. For 5 long years, the British forced surviving Kukis into communal penal labor, a punishment for daring to resist. They dug roads they'd never use, built posts for those who oppressed them. Their war had ended, but their suffering had only begun. The chieftainship system, the backbone of Kuki society, was stripped of power. The hills were redrawn, divided into neat little administrative units. Foreign officers replaced native leaders. The proud Kuki chiefs, once rulers of their own hills, now had to seek permission for every decision. And the warriors, disarmed, thousands of muskets seized, their fighting spirit branded as rebellion. That's how a people who once ruled their hills became strangers on their own land. The human cost. No one truly knows how many died, but the oral stories tell us enough. The British lost around 150 to 200 soldiers, including Gurkhas and sepoys. But the Kuki losses were far heavier. 800 to 1,200 warriors killed, and thousands more civilians, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000, perished from famine and disease. Imagine if a war had killed 1% of soldiers and 4% of civilians in America today. That would be over 13 million people. That's the scale of loss the Kukis experienced relative to their population. The worst damage wasn't what the British burned. It was what they broke inside the people. The trauma of the war ran deep. Whole generations grew up haunted by fear. Some refused to fight at all, afraid that dying far from home without proper rituals meant being lost even in the afterlife. The old song stopped. The festivals lost their color. Where pride once lived, silence moved in. The British continued raiding villages for hidden guns even after the war, keeping everyone in a constant state of dread. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Kuki and Zeliangrong communities, once close, began to drift apart. Out of the ashes of defeat, a spark of unity began to glow. The shared pain, the shared defiance. It bound the Kukis together like never before. By 1946, that spirit rose again in the form of the Kuki National Assembly, a movement to reclaim identity and dignity. The trials and punishments. By the late 19-teens, most of the leaders of the rebellion were captured, and they were imprisoned in Imphal, Tammu, and Rangoon. These weren't fair trials in any modern sense. They were military tribunals where the outcome was predetermined. But even in chains, they stood tall. One officer wrote in his diary, "They are the proudest prisoners I have ever seen." Chungjapao Dungel, the chief who'd sparked the rebellion, was captured in late 1919. First imprisoned in Sadia Jail, Assam, later Cellular Jail, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. He was tried for rebellion and murder of British officials. The trial lasted 1 day and was sentenced to death. Pu Tintong Haokip, chief of Lijiang, first imprisoned in Sadia Jail, then later Cellular Jail. Kotintang Sitalho was never captured. He disappeared into the jungle in late 1919, and the British never found him. Some say he fled to Burma. Others say he died in the jungle, and his followers buried him in secret. Nobody knows for sure. Dozens of other chiefs and warriors like Injakub Kolhu, chief of Thenjol, Makang Haokip, chief of Henglep, Lokom Matai, chief of Tengnupal, Heljason Haokip, chief of Loibol, Vumgul Kipgen, chief of Tujang, Lechahao Chongloi, Pu Kondam Baite, among many others, were imprisoned, fined, or exiled. The British wanted to make sure the leadership of the rebellion was completely broken. The aftermath, a changed world. In the years immediately after the war, the Kuki Hills were quiet, subdued. People focused on survival, rebuilding homes, planting crops, trying to recover from the trauma. The British imposed direct rule. They stationed troops in the region permanently. They built roads and outposts. They forced the Kukis to pay taxes and follow British law. It was the colonization they'd always wanted, now fully accomplished. The labor conscription issue, the thing that started it all, was dropped. The British never tried to conscript Kuki laborers again. It wasn't worth the trouble, but the deeper issues remained. The Kukis still didn't have control over their own land. Their chiefs were now subordinate to British officials. Their traditional practices were restricted or banned. They were second-class subjects in their own homeland. Christianity started spreading more rapidly through the region during this period. Missionaries had been active before the war, but after, many Kukis converted. Some saw Christianity as a way to access Western education and power. Others were drawn to the message of hope and redemption after so much suffering. The traditional religion, animism, ancestor worship began to fade. Within a generation, most Kukis were Christian. That's a profound cultural shift, whatever you think about the merits of it. The women's trauma, an untold chapter. Here's something remarkable. Out of all this suffering came a quiet strength. When villages were burned and men were off fighting or dead, women became responsible for everything. They had to keep children alive in the jungle with no resources. They had to avoid British patrols while searching for food. They had to watch their children starve because there simply wasn't enough to eat. And they lived with constant fear, fear of assault, fear of capture, fear of losing their children. This wasn't paranoia. These were real dangers. British and Gurkha soldiers had power and few constraints. Women were vulnerable in ways men weren't. After the war, many women had lost husbands, brothers, sons. They had to rebuild lives without the men who would have been providers and protectors in traditional Kuki society. Some remarried, others lived as widows, which was hard both economically and socially. The cultural loss, songs and stories. One of the saddest losses from the war was cultural. The Kukis had a rich tradition of songs and oral poetry. They sang about heroes, about history, about their relationship with the land. These songs were how they remembered their past. Many of those songs were lost. Old people who knew them died during the war or in the famine afterward. The disruption meant songs weren't being taught to the next generation. When someone who knew a song died, sometimes the song died with them. Some warriors' songs, the ones sung before battle, were deliberately suppressed after the war. The British didn't want martial traditions continuing. They pressured Christian converts to abandon these heathen practices. So people stopped singing them and gradually forgot. Today, scholars are trying to recover what they can. They're recording the few remaining elders who remember fragments of old songs. They're reconstructing stories from scattered pieces. But much is gone forever. That's a kind of death too, the death of a culture's memory of itself. It may be harder to quantify than battlefield deaths, but just as real. A moment of mercy, the Christmas truce that almost happened. In December 1918, there was a brief, unofficial ceasefire in one area of the hills. This isn't well documented in official records, but oral traditions on both sides remember it. A British patrol and a group of Kuki warriors ended up trapped by heavy rain in the same valley. The rain was so severe that fighting was impossible. Everyone was just trying to find shelter and stay dry. They ended up in caves on opposite sides of the valley, watching each other. They could have exchanged fire, but the British officer, a young captain, made a decision. He walked out into the rain, unarmed, hands up. The Kuki warriors could have shot him. Instead, their leader, we don't know his name, came out too. They met in the middle. They couldn't understand each other's languages, but they worked out a basic agreement. Nobody shoots until the rain stops. 3 days later, when the rain cleared, Both groups moved on without fighting. That captain wrote about it in a letter. He said he looked into the Kuki leader's eyes and saw a man like himself, tired, wet, far from home, sick of war. In that moment, the enmity seemed pointless. It's a small story. It didn't change the outcome of the war, but it reminds us that even in brutal conflicts, people are still people. Sometimes they choose mercy over violence, even when they don't have to. The songs that survived, Fragments of Memory. Some traditional Kuki war songs survived, passed down through generations. Let me share one, translated roughly into English. The hills remember when we were free, before the white men came with their guns. We fought like tigers. We died like men. Our blood waters the roots of these trees. Tell my son when he grows strong that his father did not kneel. Tell him the names of those who fell, so they live forever in his heart. That's not a literal translation. The Kuki language has rhythms and metaphors that don't carry over to English, but it captures the spirit. These songs were illegal for a time after the war. The British discouraged anything that celebrated resistance, but people sang them anyway, quietly in private. That's how they survived. Another fragment, sung by women. We planted rice in ashes. We raised children in caves. We buried our dead in secret, but we did not forget. The British think they won because our villages burned, but we carry the fire inside. It will never go out. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're acts of resistance themselves, refusing to let memory die, insisting on the right to tell your own story.